If you begin to pay attention to your thoughts, you may notice something unusual. They're not random. They tend to follow patterns, repeating in slightly different forms, reinforcing the same assumptions over time. And without realizing it, you begin to respond to life through those assumptions. But what most people don't realize is that these patterns can be changed, not all at once, but gradually, through the way you think, the way you speak internally, and the way you interpret what happens around you. Because if your thoughts are shaping your perception, then changing your thoughts begins to change what you notice, how you respond, and eventually, what you experience. The question is not whether this process is happening. The question is whether you are directing it or simply repeating it. If these patterns can be changed, then the next question becomes, where do you begin? It often starts with something very simple, but easily overlooked: the way you speak to yourself. In moments that matter, most internal dialogue is automatic. It reflects past experiences, old assumptions, and repeated interpretations. And because it is familiar, it is rarely questioned. But if you begin to observe it, you may notice that many of your thoughts lean toward doubt, hesitation, or limitation, not because they are true, but because they have been repeated. And what is repeated begins to feel convincing. This is where a shift can begin, not by forcing positive thinking, but by introducing more stable, intentional thoughts. For example, instead of immediately assuming something will not work, you might begin to think, I'll find a way to handle this. Instead of reinforcing uncertainty, you might begin to replace it with, I tend to figure things out over time. These thoughts are not dramatic. They don't need to be. What matters is that they are repeated consistently enough to begin forming a new pattern. Because over time, the thoughts you return to most often begin to influence how you respond, without effort. And once your responses begin to change, your results start to follow. If your thoughts influence how you respond, and your responses influence your results, then over time, a pattern begins to form. And that pattern can feel like reality itself. It can feel fixed, predictable, even unavoidable. But in many cases, what you are experiencing is not just reality. It is a reflection of what you have come to expect from it. Because expectation quietly shapes attention, you begin to notice what aligns with it and overlook what is not. And as this continues, your experiences begin to reinforce the same pattern. Not because it is the only possibility, but because it is the one being repeated. This is where people often feel stuck. They believe they are observing life as it is, when in reality, they are observing a version of it, filtered through familiar thoughts. So if you want to begin changing outcomes, the shift does not start with forcing action. It starts by becoming aware of what you expect to happen, in simple moments, throughout the day. For example, when you think about something you want, what is your immediate reaction? Is it certainty? Or is it hesitation? Do you assume it is possible? Or do you quietly expect resistance? These small reactions matter more than they seem, because they are repeated. And what is repeated becomes dominant. So instead of trying to convince yourself of something extreme, you begin with something more stable. You begin to think in ways that allow progress. Instead of thinking, this probably won't work, you begin to think, this could work, and I'll continue moving toward it. Instead of assuming delay means failure, you begin to interpret it as part of the process. Not blindly, but intentionally, because the way you interpret events determines whether you continue or withdraw. And over time, that difference becomes significant. This is how change begins, not through sudden transformation, but through consistent shifts in how you think, in moments that used to go unnoticed. Once you begin to notice these patterns, something else becomes clear. Your internal dialogue is not fixed. It can be adjusted, not by forcing positivity, but by choosing what you return to, again and again, because the thoughts you revisit most often begin to feel natural, and what feels natural begins to guide your behavior, without effort. This is why small changes matter, not dramatic statements, but subtle shifts in how you think, in real situations. For example, when something doesn't go as planned, your first reaction may be frustration or doubt. You may immediately assume that something is wrong, but instead of reinforcing that reaction, you can begin to introduce a different pattern. You can pause and think, this is part of the process. I'll adjust, not because it sounds good, but because it allows you to continue. And continuing is what creates momentum. Or when you think about something you want, instead of immediately questioning it, you can begin to approach it differently. You might think, this is something I can move toward, step by step. Again, not extreme confidence, but stable direction, because the goal is not to convince yourself instantly. The goal is to think in ways that support action, instead of preventing it. Over time, these small adjustments begin to compound, and what once felt difficult begins to feel normal, not because circumstances changed first, but because your response to them did. As you begin to change the way you think, another pattern becomes easier to notice. The difference between scarcity and abundance, not in a material sense, but in the way you perceive possibility. Scarcity often shows up quietly. It sounds like hesitation, like doubt, like the assumption that there isn't enough time, enough opportunity, enough ability. And when you think from that perspective, your decisions begin to reflect it. You hold back, you delay, you question more than you act, not because you lack potential, but because your thinking limits what feels realistic. Abundance, on the other hand, does not mean believing everything will happen instantly. It means recognizing that there is always a path forward, even if it isn't clear yet. It sounds different internally. It sounds like, there are ways to move toward this. Or, I don't need to have everything figured out to begin. And when you think this way, your behavior begins to shift. You take small steps. You stay engaged. You continue. This is where the difference becomes visible. Because over time, those small actions compound, and what once seemed distant begins to feel attainable. Not because everything changed around you, but because you stopped approaching it from limitation, and instead began approaching it from possibility. As these patterns continue to shift, something deeper begins to change. Not just your thoughts, but the way you see yourself. Because underneath every repeated thought, there is an identity, a quiet assumption about who you are and what is possible for you. And most of the time, this identity is not chosen consciously. It is formed through repetition, through past experiences, through what you've told yourself, again and again. And once that identity feels familiar, your behavior begins to align with it, without effort. If you see yourself as someone who struggles, you begin to expect difficulty. If you see yourself as someone who hesitates, you begin to delay. Not because you have to, but because it feels consistent. This is why changing thoughts alone is not always enough. They must be repeated until they begin to form a different sense of self, a different internal position. For example, instead of thinking, I hope this works out, you begin to think, I'm someone who follows through. Instead of, I'm not sure I can do this, you begin to shift toward, I'm learning how to handle this. These changes are subtle, but over time, they begin to reshape how you respond. Because when your identity shifts, your actions begin to follow naturally. You no longer need to force yourself. You begin to act in ways that feel consistent with who you believe you are becoming. And that shift quietly changes everything. If these changes are repeated, they begin to reach a deeper level. A level that is not always obvious, but constantly active. The subconscious. This is where patterns are stored. Not as ideas, but as automatic responses. Things you no longer have to think about, because they have been practiced enough. And this is why repetition matters. Not because you are trying to convince yourself, but because you are training familiarity. What you return to consistently becomes easier to believe. And what becomes easier to believe begins to feel natural. For example, if you repeatedly think in ways that support progress, even in small ways, your mind begins to expect movement. You begin to notice opportunities more quickly. You respond with less hesitation. You recover from setbacks more easily. Not because you forced it, but because it has become your default pattern. This is how change stabilizes. Through consistency, not intensity. You don't need to think perfectly. You don't need to eliminate every doubt. You simply need to return, again and again, to the direction you want to move in. Because over time, the thoughts you repeat most often become the ones you rely on automatically. And once that happens, your behavior follows, without resistance. At this point, the process becomes something you can apply, not in theory, but in everyday moments. Because this is not something that only works in ideal situations. It works in the small decisions, the quiet reactions, the way you interpret what happens throughout the day. For example, when you wake up and begin thinking about what lies ahead, what is your default response? Do you expect pressure? Or do you approach it with a sense of direction? When something unexpected happens, do you immediately assume it will disrupt everything? Or do you pause and consider how to respond differently? These moments may seem minor, but they repeat, and what repeats shapes your experience. Even in conversations, you may notice patterns. Do you hold back what you want to say? Do you assume how others will respond before giving yourself the chance? Or do you begin to approach interactions with a different expectation? These shifts are subtle, but they accumulate, and as they accumulate, your experience begins to change. Not all at once, but steadily. Because you are no longer reacting automatically. You are responding intentionally. And that difference, over time, becomes visible in your actions, in your confidence, and in the results that follow. As you begin to apply this, you may notice something else. Resistance, not from the outside, but from within. Thoughts that question the process. Doubt that appears, even when you are trying to shift your thinking. This is normal, because your mind is used to familiar patterns, and anything unfamiliar can feel uncertain at first. You may begin to think, this won't last, or this feels forced, or even, this isn't working. But these thoughts are not signals to stop. They are simply reflections of what has been repeated before. And this is where consistency becomes important. Not perfection, but persistence. Instead of reacting to doubt, you begin to observe it. You notice it, without immediately accepting it, and then you return to the direction you've chosen, even if it feels subtle, even if it feels slow, because change does not always feel dramatic. It often feels quiet, gradual, almost unnoticeable at first. But over time, those small returns begin to weaken old patterns and strengthen new ones, until what once felt unfamiliar begins to feel natural, and what once felt automatic begins to fade. This is the part most people miss. They stop too early, not because it isn't working, but because it doesn't feel immediate. But if you continue, even in small ways, the shift continues as well. As these shifts continue, something begins to build. Momentum, not in a dramatic way, but in a steady, almost unnoticed progression. Because when you begin to think differently, you begin to act differently. And when your actions change, even slightly, your results begin to change as well. At first, these changes may be small. A decision made more quickly, a hesitation that doesn't last as long, an opportunity that you would have ignored, now being considered. These moments may seem insignificant, but they are not, because they accumulate. And as they accumulate, your experience begins to shift. Not all at once, but in a way that becomes difficult to ignore. You begin to notice that things are moving, that progress is happening, even if it is subtle. And this creates something important. Confidence. Not forced confidence, but the kind that comes from seeing results. And as that confidence grows, your thinking continues to adjust. You begin to expect progress. You begin to assume that movement is possible. And those expectations continue to influence your actions. This is how momentum builds. Through repetition, through small shifts, through consistent direction, until eventually, what once felt uncertain begins to feel normal, and what once seemed out of reach begins to feel within range. At this point, the pattern becomes clear. Your thoughts are not just passing ideas. They are the starting point of how you experience your life. They influence what you notice, how you interpret it, and how you respond. And over time, those responses shape your results. Not instantly, but consistently. This is why small changes matter, because they repeat. And what repeats becomes familiar. And what becomes familiar begins to guide your behavior automatically. You don't need to control every thought. You don't need to eliminate every doubt. You simply need to become aware and begin choosing what you return to most often. Because that choice repeated over time, becomes direction, and that direction becomes outcome. So if you begin to think differently, even in small ways, if you begin to shift your internal dialogue, if you begin to approach situations with a different expectation, then over time, your experience begins to reflect that. Not because reality suddenly changes, but because you are no longer engaging with it in the same way. And once that shift begins, it continues, quietly, consistently, and often without you even realizing it. Until one day, you look back and notice that things are different, not by chance, but by pattern. And if you begin to notice these patterns, even in small moments, you may start to see something you hadn't before, that your experience is not as fixed as it once seemed, that your thoughts are not just reactions, but starting points, and that the way you return to them, again and again, quietly shapes what follows. So the next time a thought appears, pause for a moment, notice it, not to judge it, but to understand it, and then choose what you return to next. Because that choice, repeated over time, becomes direction, and direction, given enough time, becomes reality.